This is the KN CVK40 carburetor used in the KLR 650. CV is for the CV constant velocity series of KN carburetors. K was appended to it to stand for Kawasaki, and 40 is the size of the inlet. There were at least two other versions that I'm aware of. One was also called a CVK40. It was used on the Vulcans, the Vulcan 1500s around 1998 to 2003. A very similar carburetor, the primary difference being that it had an accelerator pump built into it. Harley-Davidson also used a CV40 carburetor on their Sportsters back in the 90s. It was a little bit different in that some of the internal parts were different, and it also had a flat face on it instead of a boot fitting. The flat face was intended to mount an air cleaner directly to the carburetor. Before we get started, there are a couple of things I want you to go and review. The first is an excellent video by Wyman Wynn that talks about how to get this carburetor out of the KLR. Watching that video, you'll see how easy it is to remove the carburetor and to reinstall it with very little pain and aggravation. The second thing is a great article by a guy named Redondo Ron that was written back in the 1998 time frame. A really good article that talks about the theory of operation of the carburetor, the various circuits in the carburetor, gives you exploded pictures. You can see the parts and pieces that go into it. And so I really recommend that you review both of those things before you get started here. Now, as far as tools go, you're going to need to have a JIS screwdriver and a straight screwdriver with a very thin tip. This is one that I have ground down to where the tip is about 1 millimeter. This is used for removing the main jet. You'll need to have a small screwdriver like this one or similar for removing the idle mixture screw, a 3 millimeter Allen wrench, a pair of tweezers, and a pokey thing. This pokey thing is a bicycle spoke, and you'll need to have something along those lines. A toothpick will work fine too, a chopstick ground down on the tip, you name it, but something that you can poke with. So to take this thing apart, the first thing we want to do is pull the top off, get the spring, get the diaphragm, get the needle out, and get them safely set aside. That spring is rather long, and it's not a real powerful spring, but if you don't hold on to the cap as I'm doing with my thumb, you can find that the cap kind of pops off and the spring kind of flops out, and naturally when it flops out it lands in the dirt. So keep your thumb over the cap here. These screws that I'm taking out are not stock. These are Allen head cap screws. The stock screws are a JIS head, and it's a good idea to run down to Ace Hardware or someplace like that and find some screws that you can replace those with, both on the top and the bottom. Now, to get this off, just very carefully let the cap come up and then reach inside and grab a hold of the spring and pull the cap off and set it aside. Then pull the spring out and set it aside. Now, put your finger in here, cock it a little bit, and just gently pull up on the slide, and then reach behind the diaphragm and pull the diaphragm out. Now take your finger and just push up on the needle gently, and this retainer will come out, and then you can get the needle out. This is a stock needle. It has a head on it, kind of looks like a nail. It's fragile though. Set it aside carefully. Now if you think somebody has been in the carburetor, look out inside the diaphragm to see if a couple of washers fall out. These are number 4 washers that are used to do the 22-cent mod, and you want to make sure that you get both of them out if there are 2 in there. Turn this upside down and tap it. Now set this thing aside. The diaphragm is a little fragile, so treat it with a little bit of care. The next part to come off is the coasting enricher valve. The coasting enricher valve lives behind this little fitting and is held in place by this bracket, which also holds the elbows in place. Behind this cap or fitting is the coasting enricher diaphragm and a rather long and hardy spring. In order to take this off properly, we want to hold this firmly with our thumb and then pop these screws loose. And we'll keep thumb pressure on because, as I said, that's a hardy spring back there. Then take this bracket off. Go ahead and pull these elbows out. They're just held in with little O-rings on them. They're identical, just different colors. Gray one, at least on this carburetor, goes on the top. Now, put your fingers over those little ears that the screws were in, and now very carefully allow this to come off, keeping it as straight as you can. If you go crooked, this spring will fly out. Ask me how I know. Okay, so there's the spring. You can see how long that thing is, and it's pretty stiff. To get the diaphragm out, the easiest way to do this is with a pair of tweezers. Grab the little brass boss in the middle and just kind of wiggle it out like that and set it aside. There is a tiny little O-ring right here, and it needs to come out and get set aside. That is the O-ring that seals this transfer port that sends fuel over into the backside of the carburetor when you've got the throttle shut. And turn our attention to the bottom. At this point, it's probably a good idea to pull out the idle mixture screw. So we take our small little screwdriver, and you might, just as a point of reference, want to turn it, count the turns in and see what it was set at before. That will allow you to put it back to that same spot. Although that might not be the right spot, it's at least a good thing to know and write down. When you pull this out, you'll find that underneath the spring, or excuse me, underneath the screw is a spring, a little washer, and a packing. So now we can pull that screw out, and the spring sort of comes with it. I'm going to shake that so it goes back in. That's what the screw looks like. It's got a shank on it, and at the very tip of it is a little needle. So obviously that's delicate. Just carefully set that aside. Now you'll need your little pokey thing to kind of go inside the spring and let it come out. Now look on the end there and see if there's a washer or a packing. In this case there is not. Now we want to very carefully tap, and there they came out. Let me see if I can get a close-up of that. It's just a little tiny washer. Carefully set it aside, and a little rubber-like packing, almost like an O-ring, but it's actually more like a soft washer. Now what we can do is take off the bowl, and underneath the bowl we're going to find the floats and the inlet valve. The inlet valve, as you'll see in a second, has a soft rubber tip on it that is used to seal. The floats move up and they close the valve, and that little rubber tip is supposed to seal so that no more fuel can come in, and then when the level of fuel gets low in the bowl, the floats sink, open the valve, and fuel comes back into the bowl. We'll see in a minute that we want to make sure that that tip is nice and clean and still supple. If not, you'll need to replace it. Okay, so let's set the carburetor like this and carefully pull it off. There's the inside of the bowl.